all seen that meme on social media where there's the crazy guy with all the papers on the wall and all the things connected together, and the caption is like, well, this is of course not that. This is my ancestors coming to the Americas. But anyways, the caption under that is like, me explaining to my friends why we should go buy 100 acres of rural land and start a community together, right? Or something like that. And below that, there's a bunch of comments, and half the people are saying, that's a great idea, why don't we just do that? And they're tagging their friends. The other half of the people are saying, oh, that works great, until y'all stop getting along, and you start fighting, and people get kicked off, and you lose all your money, and da-da-da-da-da, right? So, alright, so obviously there's some valid concerns there. So after having many years of experience with intentional communities and group land buys, I have a few things to say on that matter. So obviously, if you do it in a very disorganized way, and you have like one person buy a big piece of land, now people say, oh, me and my group of friends get together and buy a piece of land. Usually that doesn't end up happening. Usually you have a group of people looking for land together. Most of them end up giving up on the search, and finally one person ends up buying a big piece of land, and they invite their friends to come live there and start a community, and yeah, it ends in disaster. And one of the problems is the kind of people that you actually need to develop to establish a community that lasts are the kind of people that are not attracted to investing much of their time and money on somebody else's land, right? So the people like families or people who have even a little bit of savings, basically anyone except like young single males who are looking for like a father figure to take care of them, which is the kind of people you tend to attract when you have what I like to call the hippie house style community or a hippie commune style community, where it's a big piece of land and there's one spot where they build a big house or a small compound of houses where everyone lives in, and they're all supposed to work together, and there's not really any land ownership. Of course, now in that meme, of course, it's not talking about that specifically. It's talking about a group of friends getting together to buy land, which can also end in disaster simply because you don't really have a good organizational system or a set of bylaws that's actually legally enforceable. And when you read about starting businesses or starting an LLC, one of the things you read is the most important thing is from the beginning, when you first start it, your bylaws have to be written in a good way, right? In a way that solves future problems that you might have. Because unless you are going to be a sole proprietor, which in the case of a group land buy, you're not going to be the sole proprietor of land. If it's truly a group land buy, there's going to be a bunch of people, right? You have no idea how to write your bylaws because you've never done that before. So a lot of people, like when I first started, of course I didn't know what the heck I was doing. So we started Terra Frutis and Fruit and learning as we went. And right when you write the bylaws in the beginning, you write it in the way that you think is good. A couple years later, I realized, oh, we should have included this, we should have included this, we should have not said this, da-da-da-da-da. All these problems start coming up. And you can't so easily go back and change them because you already have a group of people who are kind of dead set on those bylaws, some of them. You'll have a group of people where some of them are happy to just rewrite the entire bylaws in a way that makes sense. But the people who are the reason you are rewriting the bylaws are never going to allow them to be changed. So, and of course that brings us to the topic of filtering. When you're doing a group land buy, you want to be able to filter people who are going to buy into your community. And everyone thinks that's just going to solve the problems, okay? Yeah, we just have to filter we got to vet everybody. They call it vetting. We got to vet everyone who buys in and you know, you can only rely on that. That's essential, of course. You have to pay attention to that, but it's not going to save you from you're still going to have a ton of problems, even if you filter and vet really well. First reason is because you can't vet good enough. You're never going to know if somebody's going to end up being crazy a year later. You never really know somebody that well. 20 people could buy into your project, and 2 of them end up being those crazy people who spurg about everything in online chat rooms and the email threads that the group has to try to solve problems and make decisions, right? The other thing is, even at the beginning, you're going to have pressure to let in people that you might think are problematic. Because simply to get enough funding to start your project, you might need to accept some people that you're like, I'm not sure about this person, but if we don't accept them, we might have to wait a whole year to get enough funding for this project. So you might end up being pressured to accept people that aren't a good idea, which kind of bypasses the whole idea of vetting in the first place. So you need ways to kind of stop the problems that you need to accept that you're going to have problematic people in your community, in your intentional community that is also a group land buy, right? That's going to happen. It's impossible to avoid. So you need your bylaws to be written in a way that sort of stops that from happening. Now, how you actually do the bylaws, it depends what country you're in and what the laws are. I did a lot of studying on U.S. law because a lot of countries model their laws after United States law because the United States law is so awesome in a lot of ways. But anyways, so studying U.S. law is a good way to start, but you also have to know the specifics of the country you're in. So in general, when you're buying land, there's two ways that you can buy a land. Of course, there's many, many ways, but the two ways that I'm going to talk about, because I think they're the most relevant here, there's what's called co-tenancy, or there's tenancy in common, which is where all the names are on the title as property owners, and then there is owning it under a legal entity, such as an LLC. And I'm mainly going to talk about an LLC because I think that's the best way to buy land as a group. You could have tenancy in common, which is you're all basically co-owners of the property on the title. And I think that's less advantageous because you don't have as much control over what you can do in the bylaws. And your bylaws, there's no legal structure to make up bylaws for. I mean, you can make a private contract between all the co-owners of a property, of course, but there's certain things you can't do in those bylaws. You can't violate anyone's property rights, certainly. But there's also ways that they can sort of violate your property rights or simply dissolve the community. For example, if you're a property owner in many countries, including the United States, you have something that's called the right to forced partition. So anytime anybody who owns the property together can just sue the others and is guaranteed they're going to win and get the property just titled separately. And that's not good because the idea of having an intentional community is you're going to have some control over who your neighbors are. But the other thing is you can't really have control over who your neighbors are in a co-owned property because those people can simply sell to whoever the heck they want to. You can't really do share transfer restrictions in a group land buy with tenancy in common the way you can with an LLC, which is one of the great benefits of doing with an LLC. Is you have some control over who. Now in co-tenancy, as for example in the Freehaven community, there's sort of informal control. The owners, in the private contract, it says you can only sell to somebody who's approved by the owners. And so far, that's generally been the case. But that's not to say that somebody could simply exercise their legal right and do whatever they wanted to. So really, in order to have a good organizational structure, you need to basically, with your friends who want to do the group land buy, you register an LLC corporation, right? And the LLC buys the land. So you and your friends own the land because you own the LLC and the LLC owns the land, right? If the LLC were ever to get forcibly dissolved, then you would have to decide what to do with the assets, which would have probably either get sold if you agreed to that, or divided up among the co-owners of the LLC members, whichever the LLC members decided. So anyways, some of the other benefits of buying a property under an LLC are, of course, you can draft LLC corporate bylaws, an operating agreement, which has a whole lot of really great and detailed stuff dealing with problems. One of the things you can do is you can assign management roles and normal shareholder roles. So you can be like, okay, these two people are, or these 4 people of the group of 20, for example, are the board, right? And they could even be elected each year or every 2 years. They manage the property. Everyone else basically kind of lets the property be managed, and they only get involved in the case of like a budget vote or something really important, or changing the bylaws, something that affects all members. And that really helps because otherwise you can get members demanding that they have a say in every single little tiny decision in the terms of the day-to-day operation of the LLC. And so, of course, if you do a group land buy and the LLC owns the property, you're going to be dividing the property into little chunks, not subdividing it, but on paper, you know, in the agreement between the LLC members, the co-owners, is going to be like, okay, this is your lot, this is your lot, this is your lot, now we need a driveway so everyone can get to their lots, right? So the driveway is called a common element, right? The driveway stays under the control of the LLC. And maybe there's a community area or a community hub that has some facilities that everybody can use. That's under the control of the LLC. The LLC needs to be able to manage those things. It needs to be able to pay property taxes. It needs to be able to manage the property boundary, maybe maintain a communal fence along the property boundary or something like that. There's a lot of things the LLC needs to do. And so if you have a small management team that's dealing with those things, competent people who know what they're doing, they can do that. And you're not going to have random, weird, crazy people sending a bunch of angry emails accusing everyone of stealing the money. And because believe it or not, those things do happen. You could have a really well-run community. The finances, of course, you need to be keeping track of them with double entry accounting software, doing things the right way, right? You could do everything the right way and have really responsible people doing their job, and you're still guaranteed you're going to have LLC members sending crazy emails accusing the people in charge of stealing money without any evidence, right? And things like that. So if they have evidence, then you need to do something about it, right? Then you need to fire those board members. So back to what I was saying before is in the bylaws you can basically state that there's going to be managers or a board that handle these day-to-day functions. So that way the shareholders aren't making a huge mess in the background, trying to micromanage them, or because you're going to have mentally ill people. You're probably going to have federal informants, and they're always going to try to disrupt. So you need to try to sort of get them to stand back a little bit and let the competent people do their things. Now, I mentioned federal informants. I have, of course, an interesting theory on this. You can spend a lot of time trying to worry about if people in your organization are a Fed or not, and I think in a way it's kind of silly because the Feds do the same things that mentally ill people do. When they go into an organization, and don't be so naive to think that you're never going to get, they would never even think about you, right? They have put agents and spent tens of thousands of dollars putting informants into organizations that are smaller and less important than yours. Like tiny environmental activist groups of like 7 or 8 people will throw a Fed in there and spend tens of thousands of dollars or hundreds of thousands of dollars in federal resources on nothing. So, but anyways, it's pointless to theorize because when they're trying to disrupt a group, they do the exact same things that a mentally ill person. And you might never have federal informant, but you're going to have people who are loopy in the head. And these are the things they'll do. Compulsive lying. They'll send long group emails just making up random things about other people in the group and causing all kinds of drama. Concern trolling. Basically non-genuine, telling people that the leadership of the group is mismanaging, all these long drawn-out complaints about all these things are going wrong, and actually most of the people in the group are happy with how it's being run, but because people don't have experience with this kind of behavior, they kind of tolerate these complaints and they talk about it, they feed the person's delusions, etc., etc. And so we have compulsive lying, we have concern trolling, we have purity spiraling, which is basically every community is going to be based on something, whether it's a certain religion, a certain ethnic group, a certain set of beliefs or a diet or ethical system or something like that. And they're going to be the ones who are spurging out constantly and just like, we need to be more pure, this person's doing this and I don't consider this to be in line with the group and da-da-da-da-da. And so they're generally going to be doing those 3 things: compulsive lying, concern trolling, and purity spiraling. And of course the compulsive lying also ties into the whole people are going to make up stuff out about others in the group, accuse them of stealing money and mismanaging without any evidence. So if you take those 3 things and you make those things illegal in the bylaws, then when someone starts doing them and causing a whole bunch of problems, you just call a vote. As a managing board member, you say, okay, if 3/4 of the board agrees that this person is doing this, now all of a sudden they're excommunicated. They can only participate in referendum votes on changing the bylaws, and that's it. Yeah, you can even take their vote away completely. So the bylaws really allow you to have your community run smoothly and efficiently. And if you have a group of 20, you're going to have 1, 2, or 3 people who are either mentally ill or federal informants, and they're going to be doing the same things no matter which of the 2 groups they are. So if you don't make those rules right at the beginning and foresee those problems, your community is going to be crazy. There's going to be all kinds of drama and intense email threads, people arguing about stuff constantly. Trust me, you don't want that to happen. So of course, back in the day, maybe 10 years ago, when I first started to get into the beginning of the ideas of group land buys and forming intentional communities, I didn't know any of this. And I thought most people were, in general, well-intentioned and everything would just go well. And getting into it, you start to learn all these things that would happen. I wish there was someone back then who had a whole bunch of experience that could tell me these things. Now, there are resources like, there's a great book on starting intentional communities, there are legal resources online about group land buys, but there's specific things that get in the way with that. And also, you simply don't know what you don't know. It's the Dunning-Kruger effect. So now that I know all these things, I'm just going to talk about them non-stop for long periods of time until anybody knows. And then now anyone who is starting intentional communities or group land buys will hopefully be watching my videos and be like, oh, this guy knows what he's talking about. He's run into all these problems. I don't even know these problems could exist, right? So finally, in your organization's bylaws, you might want to have a way to kick people out. And this is tricky and dangerous because you're not going to attract people who think they're going to just get kicked out and lose their land. I heard of a community in Hawaii, intentional community, where people would buy in, a family would pay $50,000 and buy into the community and get like a house or whatever. And then a couple years later, the people in charge simply wouldn't like them and would kick them out and they wouldn't get their money back. And obviously that's a very bad way of running things, and those people should never have paid $50,000 to join the community without a contract, without being LLC members. There was no legal structure in this community. It was so stupid. So you don't want that kind of thing. But you also probably do want to be able to force somebody to leave, because they could end up doing some really bad criminal things, or they could end up suing you, or they could end up, I don't know, there's a lot of things that could go wrong. So you need to balance the two things. You don't want to create a situation where you're taking somebody away from their home and their land, right? You don't even want the risk that that's going to happen, just because some people voted for it. On the other hand, you don't want to be forced to keep people who are around who are genuinely problematic and just making life really bad for everybody. So what I would like to talk about a little bit is there's differing stages of kicking people out, right? You could simply force somebody to sell their share in the LLC. Of course, you can do that. You can't do that with tenancy in common. You can't force somebody to sell their share of the land in general, aside from in certain cases. But with an LLC, you can put things in the operating agreement giving certain options, right? So you can say simply mandate you are forced to buy land. There could even be a set buyout price that could be like you have to sell it for the price that you paid for it, plus the value of any improvements you added to the property, and then the other shareholders have to buy them out. And then resell the share to somebody else, or something like that. There's ways to do that, and that's the extreme. You don't ever want to have to do that unless you really have to, right? So before doing that, there are things you can do. Like I said, if someone was engaging in disruptive communication processes that are really harming your community, you can simply not include them, and you can have a formal way to simply not include them in group discussions and decision-making processes. You can take away their vote. For a period of time, you can say, if you engage in these activities, we will remove your vote and excommunicate you for 6 months. And then everyone breathes a sigh of relief, because this person is all of a sudden, they're not writing many paragraph-long emails ranting about stupid things that nobody cares about, right? It causes what's called correspondence fatigue. I remember reading a document from like the FBI or the CIA in the 1970s, or the 1980s, talking about how to disrupt organizations, and causing correspondence fatigue was one of the things. Like, this is back in the day of typewriters, writing letters that were pages long, complaining about everything in a seemingly genuine way. So where was I? Right. So you have people will breathe a sigh of relief when that person is no longer able to communicate, and that will generally solve most problems. You can forbid people from accessing like the community area on the property. If you can say, okay, you can only go on the driveway to your house. You can no longer benefit from the community facilities. You can do that. It's an LLC, right? Of course, anything you do, anybody can sue you and force you to do the other thing. But if it's in your LLC bylaws, you have a very good case of them not winning any lawsuit. Because the judge will simply say, hey, the LLC bylaws say this. It's not illegal to put this in the LLC bylaws. Therefore, you were treated fairly. So that's why I think it's so important to have property under an LLC and not just tenancy in common. So maybe they're not involved in the group emails except for really important votes. Maybe they're not allowed in the community facilities, etc., etc. Maybe an even further option, now they can no longer reside on their own property. Maybe they can still own it and rent it out, but they can no longer... This is an example of somebody who, for example, they have a heroin addiction, and they're bringing drugs onto the property, and it's really serious, and there's sketchy drug dealers being invited to their property, and we're like, we don't want this at our community. We've tried intervention, we've tried sending you to rehab, nothing's working, so now we're just going to, as an LLC, forbid you from using... Maybe they terminate the lease. Maybe the LLC is actually leasing each lot to its members, and now they just terminate the lease and say, well, you can no longer come on the property, but you can rent it out to anybody else, just not you. That's another option, right? And then finally, the last, most extreme option is forcing them to sell, right? Now, you need to check your local laws on this, because, for example, in the United States, everything that I just said is pretty much possible. For example, in Ecuador, right, where I have some experience with a couple communities here, the LLC laws aren't quite as free, so it's a bit harder to make an LLC. For example, the LLCs that we're thinking of forming for two communities here, there's not an easy way for us to put share transfer restrictions where you can only sell to it. So we're going to have to continue with informal share transfer restrictions, but that's okay. All right, it's still better than what we did before. In terms of forcing somebody to sell, it's not as easy to put it into the bylaws in Ecuador. Rules that allow you to force somebody to have a forced a forced buyout. I think is what it's called. In fact, there are a certain number of things that there's a certain list of things the person can do, mainly illegal activities and like directly working against the interests of the organization and stuff like that. sabotage and theft, things like that, then you are allowed to sue the person and force a sale of their share. But other than that, you can't. So yeah, in some countries the LLCs, even in some U.S. states, the LLC laws are different. So you have to look into that. But it's something that you need to look into if you're starting a group land buy or a group land buy with an intentional community on it. Finally, I just want to mention one last topic that I've been researching as well is if you're starting a community and you're doing group land buy, obviously your community is based on something, right? Now, if your community is based on something that's not legally a protected class under discrimination laws in your country, that's fine. You can discriminate based on diet. For example, say you want to start a community based on the paleo diet. So anybody that doesn't eat the paleo diet is not allowed to join your community. Diet is not a restricted class, so that's not illegal. But now say you're Norwegian and you live in the United States and you want to start a community for Norwegians. Only Norwegians. No other people, no other ethnic backgrounds are allowed, right? Under the Fair Housing Act, 1968, and another law, I forget what it's called, in 2010, that's totally illegal. You can get sued for that. Say an Estonian person wants to join your Norwegian community, and they can sue you and they'll win. You could either get fined or you can simply be handed down a judgment that says you are forced to allow this person to join your community. So you have to know what the protected classes are if you're starting a community, and are you allowed to exclude certain people. And in the case of the United States, for example, in the case of the Norwegian community, there are ways that you can start a Norwegian community where only Norwegians are allowed to join and buy in, but you have to know the law. You have to know how the Supreme Court, what criteria the Supreme Court has set for starting a community like that. For example, you cannot sell to the general public. You have to be very specific and exclusive. For example, your criteria can't only be Norwegian, there have to be other criteria as well. There's a whole list of things, but you have to look into that. So it's okay if your community is based... By the way, religion is also protected class. So that makes it kind of difficult for religious communities. On the other hand, the United States did pass Religious Freedom Restoration Act, so it's kind of like you have the Religious Freedom Restoration Act working against the Equality Act. So in some cases, religious communities, it's easier for them to discriminate against a protected class, which is anyone who's not their religion, as long as they meet certain criteria that the Supreme Court has set. So no matter what country you're in, you should also not assume that what you're doing is illegal. You should do extensive research into it and make sure you're good in all areas before striking forward. So, final conclusion, before I go on for too long. A few things I've talked about. First of all, group land buy and intentional community, in my opinion, they go together. All right? You can have a neighborhood and just have people that you know buy land in the neighborhood, but in the end, it's not going to end up as an intentional community because they can just sell to whoever. It's not going to be as tight-knit, etc. So, and if you have an intentional community that's not a group land buy, you don't really attract many people. You don't attract the right kind of people. It doesn't really grow. So you need to have a group land buy and a community. In terms of legal ways that you can buy land as a group, it can either be tenancy in common, which is co-owners on a title, or it can be an LLC or other type of corporation owning the land title, and then basically the members of the intentional community own the LLC. I think that's the best way to do it, and I think you have to write your bylaws in a really good way, specifically share transfer restrictions, forced buyout, right of first refusal, and for example, code of conduct. Your code of conduct is going to say how people can conduct themselves in official communications, and different steps for mitigating those processes and mitigating those problems in a very clear way. And finally, one last idea, one last thing that the LLC sort of makes possible, since you might have issues with property registrars if you try to put 85 people on a land title. But if you have an LLC, you can have 85 people as LLC members, no problem whatsoever. So you can have a situation where you buy a land, and everyone who buys into the LLC, they pay a certain amount of money, and say the standard share size is 5%. So everyone buys into 5%, maybe based on the land size. For that 5% share, they get 4 acres of land, right? Or 1 hectare of land, etc. Now maybe 5% or above in the LLC bylaws gives you a right to reside on the land. Anything less than 5%, you cannot live on the land, but you're still an owner and you can still sell your share, which hopefully holds its value. It's tied to a piece of land. So the way this could work is this can help a lot of people who don't really have many savings at least get their foot in the door, at least own an asset which is tied to property, own a share of the LLC, they can sell in the future, or in the future they can buy out. There could be a bunch of like 0.5% shareholders. It doesn't matter. You don't involve them in the voting. You don't involve them in the decision-making process. They literally get nothing except a financial statement each year and a certificate that says they're an owner, right? Maybe a newsletter if you're nice, right? So, but they're LLC members. So you have like 20 people who have no money, but they're like, I want to get my foot in the door. So they buy a 0.25% or 5%, half a percent share, and you have a whole bunch of people that own tiny shares. None of them can live on the property. None of them have access rights. So there's maybe 1 or 2 shares set aside for these like investment shares, right? And if one of them ends up making more money, they can buy those tiny shares from the other, and once they reach 5%, then they get a lot. They can live on the property. So that could be an interesting way if you have a bunch of people. You have like 18 people and you almost have enough funds to buy the land, but you need some more. You can do schemes like that with an LLC in a much easier way than with getting those names in the title, which can be kind of difficult. So that's all I have to say on the topic. Hopefully y'all have some interesting things, comments to say below the video. Make sure you're checking out my Telegram channel, which the link is below the video. And yeah, that's all. Subscribe to my